Değerli misafirlerimiz, konferansımız Associate Profesör Doktor Colin Green, Developing and Sustaining Competence in HCI Education başlıklı konuşmalarıyla devam edecektir. Konuşmalarını yapmak üzere Luddy School of Informatics, Computing and Engineering at Indiana University Bloomington'dan Associate Profesör Doktor Colin Green konferansımıza uzaktan katılacaklardır. Sözü kendilerine bırakıyorum. Dear guests, our conference will resume with a speech by Professor Dr. Colin Gray, titled Developing and Sustaining Competence in HCI Education. Professor Colin Gray from the Luddy School of Informatics, Computing and Engineering at Indiana University Bloomington will be joining our conference remotely. I now give the floor to Professor Colin Gray.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction and for the invitation to speak at what it sounds like it's been a great two-day event held virtually and in Turkey. It's my pleasure to talk through a little bit of my experiences over the last decade in research on HCI education, and then particularly over the last 9 years or so in building programs both in the United States and connections abroad with this goal of developing and sustaining students' competence both in the classroom and once they go out and work in practice. So like many people in the HCI context, I'm a bit of a misfit, and I'm happily so. There are many different perspectives that HCI draws from, and for me, that mix started with graphic design. I found my way into instructional design, first in consulting and then later through a PhD. And then I discovered HCI during my doctoral training and ended up really having a big focus on HCI education and HCI pedagogy. Now, a decade ago, when I was doing some of that initial research, this was not a research field as such. That is quickly changing, though, which is one of the real points of excitement here. So as we know within the HCI space, there's a plurality of perspectives that we bring together. There's a plurality of scholarship. This is one mapping that shows the 3 different waves of HCI and the 3 different paradigms of HCI, showing that there's this epistemological plurality in the work that we do. There's also a plurality of knowledge that we need as educators as well, which is why educating students in this domain can be so challenging. This model that from Anthony Faiola from 2006 was called the Design Enterprise Model. And this really described an early perspective on HCI education that showed that, a professor that might only be trained in one discipline, like computing or in design, really can struggle to bring all these different perspectives together for students. And within the ACM, one of the largest organizations that addresses the HCI space, this has been an issue in really understanding the nature of HCI education challenges for quite a long time. In the 1980s, they were just getting established as a discipline, putting out this report. In the 90s, they were figuring out what that alignment might look like in relation to industry needs and requirements, still a challenge today, by the way. In the 2000s, they were really starting to grow and realize a sense of stability within the discipline. And in the 2010s, really up until today, there's been some realignment to figure out, like, what does this look like? What can this look like globally? And how can we grow this curriculum over time? And indeed, there's this common theme that you've probably seen since the 1980s to today of volatility. Former collaborator of mine, Yubo Ko, who's now at Penn State, and I studied this in the context of Reddit and Stack Exchange, looking at how the landscape of UX practice is complex, it's constantly changing, it's bringing in different disciplinary norms and different sources of knowledge, and really it's on not only practitioners to negotiate that space and figure out how to remain competent over time, but also to figure out what does that mean for HCI educators and HCI researchers as well, so that they're constantly understanding that the audience they might be speaking to is changing and shifting. So, one of the initial questions that I've had is, where does HCI education fit in? As I mentioned a decade ago, there wasn't a big space for HCI education. There were a few papers out there that were addressing the context, but I think the general assumption was, let's focus on really building the state-of-the-art research and the educational context will follow. Now, what we've seen with the reports commissioned by SIGCHI and others is that that hasn't always been the case. And so really over the last 6 to 7 years, there's been a concerted effort by a number of people within the community to build out a space where we can talk about HCI educational practices and think about not only benchmarking our own programs, but also figuring out what can we be doing better in response to this volatility and rapidly changing nature of the discipline. And in particular, we can look at all of these different kinds of organizations that in some way impact HCI education, whether it come from engineering or from design or from the interaction design context, and in different environments, whether it be in the Americas, in Europe, or internationally more generally. I've been involved with an organization called Educai for the last 5 years. We're really excited that in 2024, in June, we will be hosting our first standalone conference on HCI education specifically. It'll be the 6th iteration of Educai. And this is now a community where people can learn from each other and also publish work that is peer-reviewed on HCI education issues. So more to come on that if you're interested. So I'll structure the rest of my talk sort of around 3 core topics, but I want to start by framing up educational research in HCI. Now, in looking at the program, there's a broad range of HCI work that's represented, which is really exciting to me to see. But I know that many of you are probably not coming from an educational research background, which is fine. I want to give you a sense of how the complexity, though, and maybe 5 different ways of thinking about HCI education and competence that aren't just about content. Because often our minds as educators start with content, and instead I'm maybe proposing that there are more perspectives that we can acknowledge and learn from as we're addressing this space. Now, why not content? Well, as I mentioned, the nature of the discipline has changed really rapidly over time. And so if we benchmark only on content and not on some of these other perspectives, we might miss some of these really important perspectives that we really need students to take on so that they can sustain their competence over time, even after they leave the classroom. So if we think about that formal educational environment, what's often called the formal pedagogy, that's where we tend to focus our efforts. But in fact, there's a student experience surrounding that formal pedagogy that we can pay attention to as well. That was the topic of my dissertation a decade ago, and still something that I'm really interested in figuring out. Because the thing that we plan for students to experience isn't always the thing that they experience. And while students are engaging in those educational experiences that we've designed for them, they're also thinking about, what do I want to be when I graduate from this program? In other words, how am I going to align with a professional practice community? Now, in HCI, there are many different paths that can be taken, whether it be more traditional UX design roles or UX research roles or product management roles, or even hybrid roles with development or engineering. So every student is going to have a different sense of how they want to fit into that future professional practice community, even while they're still a student. And that's something that we can really capitalize on if we can understand the nature of that identity transition. Another perspective is looking at where pedagogical knowledge, which is knowledge of how we teach a topic, and content knowledge can align. And Lee Shulman described this in the 1980s as an alignment of PCK, or pedagogical content knowledge. And so we might also ask ourselves, given the rapid shift in HCI education knowledge, what are the things that students need to know? And what are the approaches or strategies that we're using to deliver or enable students to experience that knowledge? That's pedagogical content knowledge. And how can we use that more robustly to help students anticipate some of the transitions and volatility that'll come up later in their careers, or perhaps while they're still getting a job? A third perspective is looking at using this schema from Harold Nelson and Eric Stolterman to describe what competence might look like for students and professionals. And so immediately our brain might be going to knowledge set. What do students need to know? We can all objectively agree these are the topics that students need to know about. But often, if we focus on that knowledge set too much, we miss these other 3 characteristics, which are equally important, if not more important, in maintaining competence over time. If we think about competence as a single sort of moment in time, knowledge set's a really useful characteristic to look at. But if we're looking at how competence is nurtured and develops and is maintained and sustained over time, looking at students' mindset, their skill set, and their tool set are also going to be really important to consider. Another perspective is looking at transdisciplinarity. And this is really the notion that one discipline doesn't have all the knowledge that students are going to need. Even if we look at some of what's been happening in generative AI over the last year or two, for instance, it's not enough to look at this as an algorithmic process where students can maybe understand what are the computing implications of some of what's happening. But students also need to consider, how are these systems enacting maybe ethical or equitable conditions for success? Or what kinds of data are they being modeled on? And in doing so, suddenly we need many, many more perspectives. And transdisciplinarity gives us a way in to consider multiple perspectives and also recognize that sometimes these perspectives disagree with each other in ways that students really need to be equipped and prepared to address. The final perspective I'll share is something that probably all of you have experienced and is a real challenge in a domain like HCI, which is constantly shifting and changing. And this is what's often known as the research practice divide. And so, put simply, if we look at this as academic researchers, we can say, why aren't practitioners doing the things that we're telling them to do, or that we know is a best practice based on our research? Practitioners, though, in HCI often also say, why are researchers studying the things that they are? They don't have any relevance to the work that I'm trying to do. So somewhere in between those two perspectives, we can start to figure out what are some strategies to build more alignment between research and practice, and how can we use insights from both of those communities put together to influence the ways that students are being educated as current and future members of the profession. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a sense of the breadth of what I'm talking about when I'm describing educational research, specifically in the context of HCI. It's not just about content. There's a lot more going on as well. So next, I'll share 3 stories of UX pedagogy. Now, one story I'll share in much more detail, and then the other 2 stories will really just build on those experiences in the Midwest of the United States, where I'm located, and with global partners. So there are a few different perspectives that I'll bring. Currently, I'm in the Midwest of the United States of America in Bloomington, Indiana. This is in the southern part of the state. Just moved back here this past summer to become a director of the HCI-E program at Luddy at Indiana University. But I've also, for the last 6 or 7 years or so, been a learning partner and a research partner with Beijing Normal University, where they have an innovative Master of Applied Psychology program in UX design. I've also had a long-standing relationship, almost 8 years now, with colleagues in Newcastle upon Tyne in the United Kingdom, where we've run study abroads and other kinds of research and educational exchanges to encourage students to experience different cultural norms and different settings of research and design. And then finally, I spent the previous 8 years prior to coming to IU at Purdue University in West Lafayette, Indiana, just in the northern part of the state. So I moved about 2 hours south, where alongside some colleagues, I built out one of the United States' first undergraduate program in UX design and HCI. So it's these global perspectives that really drive some of my thinking around this. And as you can see with the Educai Symposium that I mentioned earlier, there's also a lot of interest in thinking about how we can expand this community and think about HCI education as a global issue that we have to tackle together, but recognizing that there are going to be some regional or contextual differences in how we train students, depending on where we're located and what perspectives we feel are valuable for them to take on. So across these 3 contexts, 4 contexts actually, we can sort of see this adaptation of this volatility of HCI as a discipline and how I've been able to take it up alongside partners in different contexts. I'll start with Purdue. In 2015, I joined a team of faculty to develop a novel undergraduate program in UX design at Purdue. Early on, our goal was to create a pedagogical model of integrated and industry-focused design studios in order to engage students with lifelong learning practices and disciplinary perspectives using the hidden curriculum, or what students experience, but maybe not what they're explicitly taught, as an approach to encourage the development of their design and UX competence. Now, in that program, note I was here, this is a previous program, we were in a very unique space. There wasn't really an HCI program at Purdue. There was some information science presence. There was some art and design and some engineering, and we were sort of in no person's land. And so we were trying to figure out, what does UX look like without some of those traditional disciplinary moorings? And there weren't a lot of other undergraduate programs to look at to model ourselves after. So one of our big goals was to essentially look at studio learning, which is commonly used in art and design education, and to think about that as a model for engaging students in very practical, real-life application of HCI knowledge and HCI experiences, but turn that approach inside out. Now, let me tell you what I mean by inside out. Typically, this is what students experience as part of their plan of study. It's not intentional. We as educators, I think, want our programs to be integrated, but often when students think about it, they think about maybe 6 or 8 or 10 different courses or modules that they're taking that they have to get to graduate, but also they're not thinking about what are all the interconnections among those. And on the best of days, we might have really deep conversations with our colleagues about how students experience maybe transitions from one course to another. But often what ends up happening is that these are unintegrated, or they're integration points, but only in key moments in the first year, in the final year, when they're doing a foundational experience or a capstone. Instead, we thought, since we got to build something from the ground up, what if we integrate this system from the beginning and think about connections that were key and integral and core across all the experiences that students were having. So within HCI, we thought about some common perspectives that students might need to bring in with them. And so we said, okay, well, students need to know things about psychology and cognition. People need to know things about ethics, maybe some methods about observation and interviews from anthropology. And they also need to have a robust understanding of technology and design history so they can pull all these things together. So when we integrated these, we didn't say there's going to be a course on psychology and UX and a course on history and UX. Instead, we said, what is it like when we bring all those perspectives into each studio as part of the instructional design in the first place? Now, here we were leveraging work that we had done on the left with a paper that was published at CHI in 2017, looking at this integrated studio pedagogy as it was still being designed. And then at the same time, I was working on an edited book on studio teaching in a variety of higher education contexts. And so I was learning a lot from that experience as well that we could leverage in the design of this program. So we thought about, what are the things that students need to know when they graduate? And what are the themes that are likely to still be relevant a decade from now, 2 decades from now? And so we mapped these as things that were the most volatile to the least volatile. The most volatile was technical knowledge. We knew that was changing really rapidly. When we built out the program, Figma wasn't even a tool that existed, and now it's one of the most dominant prototyping tools that are used. If we had focused on Figma skills, we might have missed some really important other things in the process. So technical skills are the most volatile. Those are things that we need to prepare students for, but perhaps we're not going to do a lot of direct instruction. Somewhere in the middle are things like visual interactive representation. So how do students represent their ideas? And then social and research methods. How do they build knowledge of users and contexts? And how do they evaluate their work? That's not quite as volatile, but they still need to be quite adaptable in how they use some of those techniques over time, because society is going to change, the contexts are going to change. And then on the bottom, we have these really 3 clusters of leadership and teamwork, design philosophy, and global consciousness. In all 3 of these, it's not that they don't change, it's that they are much more malleable by nature, and they're much less prone to just dramatic shifts. Maybe aside from the pandemic pause where suddenly everyone was working remotely, we haven't seen huge shifts in leadership and teamwork strategies, for instance. So our goal was to think about those as strands and to integrate those strands as to be experienced by students over time, not as discrete courses, but as things that were always complementing each other and helping students build understanding of the complexity of HCI and UX practice. And we operationalize this through 2 different kinds of learning experiences. The first kind was these learning studios, and then the second kind were the experience studios. We've adopted some similar models now here at IU, where I'm teaching now, but this is really a recognition that students need a space to learn new content, learn new knowledge, whether it be content knowledge or experiential knowledge, and they need a chance to interact with their future profession, to figure out what is that knowledge going to look like when it's enacted. So within the learning studios, we sort of viewed this as a heightened view of reality, a project-based curriculum. So they were still getting access to authentic projects, but they were doing this integrated learning across all of these different strands, and they were having this experience as a cohort. So they would come in as a first-year student, and they'd stay with that cohort until they were a third or fourth-year student. In the experience studios, they were working on real-world projects. We were partnering with industry partners on projects that were real. The learning outcomes were determined by the client project themselves. And so this was more of a managed chaos situation because we had all of the cohorts interacting together on these project teams with built-in mentoring and peer support. So these were the building blocks of our UX curriculum. So you can see the learning studios on the top and the experience studios on the bottom that were different combinations of those cohorts as they moved through the process. A couple other things to note about this. And you note that what I'm describing here is all about sort of the learning infrastructure and the pedagogical norms. It isn't about the content, because the content is something that can be quite malleable and can shift over time as industry needs change and as the nature of the HCI space changes as well. So in this case, we had take three cohorts, the first year students, the second year students, and the third year students. They're having their own cohort-based experiences in their learning studios, and then they're coming together to work on integrated teams in the experience studio environment. In addition, we're thinking about other ways to support their learning. We know that peer mentoring is really important. There's a lot of literature on why this is so important. So matching them with a student that's a year ahead of them so that they can get a sense of what that future experience is going to be like. And they're going to be able to talk to somebody that's just had an internship this last summer and is able to give them a really authentic account of what practice is going to be like for them. Also, faculty mentoring is really important to make sure that students can have a personal connection with the people that are instructing them, and to also build out this really trusting community where it's okay to fail, it's okay to try out new things. And then finally, portfolio development, because HCI as a discipline is very much focused on showing what you know and showing that you can activate it in real context. And so thinking about how to leverage not only what you're doing and doing it well, but also being able to communicate that through portfolio cases as well. Now, bringing back that sort of knowledge of transdisciplinary learning, this was also really relevant for our work, because we could take a really disciplinary perspective to say, okay, well, there's a lot that HCI people do that also are done by people as graphic designers, as user interface designers. And so we could just say, okay, we're going to, help students build competence in graphic design. It's a very disciplinary notion of education. There's also this notion of multidisciplinarity where, we might have a goal that our students can build skills that come from psychology on cognition, for instance, to drive evaluation techniques or other things within HCI. And also maybe that they're building some skills from anthropology. And so they're joining those worlds together, and so that they can see that there are different fragments that are dealt with better by certain disciplines. However, what I think we realized as the nature of user experience design was really changing early in the program development is that we needed a transdisciplinary approach for students to take on. And that not every student's transdisciplinary experience is going to be the same, because they might have different priorities. We might have some students who really want to work on HCI in the context of health. And so they might take on perspectives from public health or from sociology that are going to be really core. Other students might come on and they want to be a UX engineer. And so their combination might be more focused on how can I bring psychology, anthropology, and computer science together to inform their own sense of transdisciplinarity. So really understanding what is that unique combination of skill sets and disciplinary knowledge that students will need to leverage, combine, and do something with to inform their future practice. One final note on this story as I wrap it up. We're trying to look at this as a holistic learning experience. As I mentioned, we're not really focusing on content. It's there. It's built into the curriculum. It's baked in. But we're focusing on what are some of the things that students are experiencing in a really consistent way, like project-based learning or reflection on their work and engaging in critique on their own work and the work of others. Also, what are the disciplinary perspectives that we think are really core that students need to experience and become conversant with? And then what are the other perspectives they might want to build or add to this
This is
list
the
as well?
concept of holistic learning experience.
And then underneath all that, we
Bak en
have,
aşağıya koymuş hidden curriculum.
I'm getting a little bit of
Bu
echo
amca
from
kim bilmiyorum.
maybe the translator.
Oy. Hocam size bu uyumaz. Müsaaden. Yapalım. Görüşürüz abi. Haber ederim sana. Bir de kaçar.
Evet hocam.
Var mı? Ne bilsin?
Okay, I'll try again. So underneath all this is the hidden curriculum, which are things that students learn, but they're never officially taught or explicitly taught. And so there are many things that could fit this description, but we really focused on designing 3 different things into our hidden curriculum. One was design leadership, so helping students really build those leadership skills so that once they go out into industry, they're able to effectively work with teams. They are supported by that vertical integration. They're constantly mentoring each other so that when they get out into industry, they're able to foster a productive HCI and design culture. The second one I alluded to earlier is productive failure. And this is essentially saying, you're going to fail in industry. And so the more that you can fail as a student, try out new things, see what works and what doesn't work, the more successful you're going to be once you're doing that with much higher professional stakes like your job. And so how can we help engage students in formative critique to interrupt bad ideas early? How can we acculturate them through peer mentorship to know that failure is an okay thing? And in fact, it's one of the best things they can be doing as they're learning about these things. And then the final part of the hidden curriculum that we really focused on was tacit knowledge. And this is thinking about what is all the knowledge that we need to effectively work within the HCI domain. There's some of it that's quite explicit, certain evaluation techniques that we need to know about and really have a good sense of how to explain to others. But there are many things that we learn that are really difficult to describe to others, but they often end up being the core of our learning experience downstream. So I'll shift briefly to those other 2 stories that I alluded to, because these were happening at the same time as that core curriculum development was happening at Purdue. Here at Beijing Normal University, we started conversations in 2017. And we were trying to identify opportunities to bridge teaching and learning practices in UX. They were developing a master's degree that was new in China, and we were developing the United States' first undergraduate program in UX. And so we were trying to figure out, is there some opportunity for cross-cultural collaboration? Now, as we started some discussions in Beijing back in 2018, we were looking at aligning our curriculum, and we discovered that, despite these really different cultural contexts, our pedagogy was brought us together. We had a lot of the same instructional norms. We were drawing on some of the same project-based techniques. So even though there were some slight differences in content, in fact, a lot of how we conceptualized the curriculum was quite similar. And indeed, as we were working in Beijing and teaching students and then inviting some of them back to Purdue as well, we were using active learning techniques that are common in a design studio. We were also working with students that had a range of different technical and disciplinary backgrounds, and really thinking about how can we bring that experience to them in a way that helps them see HCI as a unified profession with many different ways so that they might be able to shape their future career. And then in the final example, this is with Newcastle University and partners at Newcastle upon Tyne in the United Kingdom. My colleague Austin Toombs and I led study abroad experiences to engage undergraduate and graduate UX students in an approach called digital civics. And so here the goal was broadening our opportunities for engagement in UX work and helping students to develop a cross-cultural and participatory framing for HCI research and practice. And so here, not only did students get to experience a very beautiful part of the world in the northeast of England, but they also were able to work with project partners that had developed relationships with many local service providers, working on issues relating to public health, to public safety, domestic violence, socialization and loneliness around elderly adults, and issues relating to food quality and nutrition. And so here students were able to leverage the experience and content that they had from Purdue. They were able to then go overseas and use those skills in a context that might be very different from what they would be able to access back in the Midwest US. So many of these contexts, even though they may be quite different for students to experience, the methods they were able to use to address them, like storyboarding or prototyping, were actually quite similar, and they were able to extend their knowledge in really important ways. So across these three main stories, we can see that there's this connection of cross-cultural approaches to studio education within the Chinese context. There was an opportunity to create a model for integrated undergraduate HCI education in our context in the Midwest. And within the UK, there were opportunities to identify spaces for community partnerships that would extend that HCI learning even further. Now, I'll finish off with a way forward because some of this work has now been adopted and been implemented in classrooms for a number of years now. We've seen a lot of different kinds of success, but there's still a lot of work that we need to do as a community to make sure that our HCI educational practices are continuously growing and that we're considering the nature of practice as it's really shifted quite a bit over the last decade that I've been doing work in this space. So first, I'll return to this notion of pedagogical content knowledge. And we can ask the question, what does PCK look like for HCI and UX education? And you can use this as a question to maybe think about your own educational context and practices as well. So for the work that I've done, studio pedagogy has been a really key driver, but you could also think about project-based learning or other approaches like that that really activate student learning in an active way very quickly. We can also use that diagram from Nelson and Stolterman to think about what is the mindset that we want students to leave our programs with, and what are the habits of mind that they need to be enculturated into so they can effectively, hopefully ride these many shifts in industry that are going to happen over their career. The third is, what is the character they're leaving with? What are the ethical considerations that they are conversant in or that they're able to consider as they do their work? Not only in really well-known and understood situations, but also these rapidly shifting ones like AI and machine learning and the way that data can be used in really problematic ways. We can also think about transdisciplinarity. What are some new perspectives that students need to really leverage and understand in order to be successful, in addition to the technical knowledge or content knowledge that we often put as core within our programs? And then finally, what are some ways that we can partner with traditional education researchers, whether they be in computing education or other domains, to help us understand where some of the gaps lie in our educational experiences as we seek to continually update them to address industry needs and also the needs of the discipline. So there are really three perspectives that I've started to bring on in some of my own work that I'll share really briefly here. These are examples. These aren't meant to be exhaustive, but I want to give you a sense of how we can deal with some of this complexity. So the first is looking at what are the kinds of content we need to deal with. You saw the 6 categories we used in the program at Purdue, but we might think about, as a start, what are the different ways that students need to be thinking about prototyping? Are there certain methods that every student needs to have, and there are other ones that might be optional? Are there certain elements that come from design theory or ethics that every student needs to experience at some point in their curriculum? These are content issues which require us to not just slot stuff in as a course, but maybe to think about, are there 2 or 3 spots in the curriculum over a period of a year or more that we can have students have these experiences and build mastery in these areas? The second area is looking at lenses. And so we might think about, what are the unique environments that we have within our university or with other learning contexts, and what are the different perspectives that we can bring into the classroom for students to play around with? And it's likely that some programs are going to be very dominated by one or more of these perspectives, and you might not be able to be great at all of them. But thinking about what is the style of education, how are you bringing these perspectives together as lenses that students can use to think about this complexity and not to be satisfied with only one disciplinary perspective to look at the complexity of every problem. And then finally, thinking about materials. And I think this is the area where HCI still has a lot of work to do, specifically in how we think about these things and construe them in an educational environment. There are lots of different metaphors or different framings that are used to think about the complexity of HCI work. One dominant one right now is patterns and systems, for instance. So, what does your design system look like? What are the patterns that you're using to encourage familiarity or encourage consistency? Ecologies and services, another common set of materials that we can play around with to think about this as a whole roadmap that somebody might experience, and there are multiple touch points within it. But I would argue that there are actually many more that we need to be considering as potential materials as well. Probably the most important in the news right now are things like data IA and data-driven UX and artificial intelligence and machine learning. But in fact, HCI as a discipline has been addressing some of these kinds of complexity for quite a long time. And so the more that we can leverage all these different sets of materials, the more likely students are going to be able to maintain their competency over time and build the important building blocks and foundation for competence that are going to allow them to be successful 2 years from now, 5 years from now, 20 years from now. So there are lots of things that we might want to focus on as we move forward. One might be simply instructional strategies to help incorporate some of these issues and then adapt those instructional strategies over time as needs change. As I mentioned, there's also a lot that we can do on the curricular level, at the program level, to encourage success. And this requires us to align ourselves as educators and researchers to think about what we can do to bridge some of those gaps and make students feel like they're part of a holistic experience. And then finally, this is a practice-driven domain still in many ways. And so how can we build some of these effective research and practice partnerships so that students are learning the state of the art, but they're also thinking about how it can be applied in meaningful and in realistic settings. As I think has probably become clear across this talk, building a global and inclusive approach to HCI education requires all of us. Some of us are going to have more technical backgrounds. Some of us are going to have more educational backgrounds. Some of us are going to have more design backgrounds. But if we can join forces together to build out sort of the next generation of HCI education, students are going to not only benefit from building more robust competence, perhaps more quickly or more effectively, but also we're really laying the groundwork for where the discipline might end up going next. With that, I thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to answering some of your questions. And it looks like there are already some in the chat.
Colin, thank you very much for this great presentation. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, great. This is Kursat. I'm from Sabancı University. Actually, we both are Hoosiers. I'm class of 2002. I also graduated from same department, Instruction Systems Technology. So it's very nice to see. I think the background is seen from Bloomington, right? Am I right?
Yes. Yes.
Nice. Okay, so that's a beautiful place. Okay, thank you very much. This is very helpful presentation actually, because I mean we also HCI researchers. We have been working on doing HCI research, teaching, also on the practice side. But unfortunately, I mean, different than the US, we don't have a separate HCI programs. I mean, there are HCI courses under software engineering, education, information systems, informatics, the different disciplines and different flavors. Maybe this is normal because, as you said, I mean, this is a transdisciplinary area. So every discipline has its own flavor. Before making more comments, as you said, there are two comments from our colleague from Azerbaijan, Shamil Matov. He asked two questions. Can you see the questions on chat?
Yeah, I'm happy to take on the questions from Shamil. Thank you.
Let's take them first, and then I will also get comments from the room and also from the chat. Then I will also ask a couple questions. Okay, sir, first Shamil's questions. Okay, on the Zoom.
Sounds great. Yeah, so the first question is about the industry impact of the curriculum and any suggestions from industry about curriculum content. I feel like this is part of a conversation that we've started to broker and we just need to continue that kind of work. And so early on in the curriculum development I was doing at Purdue, I was also at a line of research, which I still have today, focusing on the complexity of UX design practice. And what I think I've learned through those encounters about some of this volatility and also about some of these strategies that practitioners are using to do self-learning are things that really can directly inform the kinds of curriculum that we're providing. The other thing that's really nice is that once you start to build that sense of what we called a cycle around in a 2014 paper on reprioritizing things in that research practice relationship. Now I have students that have been out in an industry for 5, 6, 7 years, and they're able to provide insights on, here's what I was taught, here's some of the educational experiences I've had, here's the complexity I'm facing now, and I'm able to cycle that around and think about how can we evolve and grow those experiences in effective ways. It's not just about saying industry needs this thing now, where do you plug it into your curriculum, but how we can make for some of those robust and coherent experiences at the educational program level so that students are prepared and conversant in the ways that they need to be. So I think the second question was about an example of cultural studies. Broad space, but you often see examples of cultural studies within media studies programs. And so this is often where more critical perspectives might emerge on the nature of technology or technology use. It's probably beyond this presentation to talk about that in depth, but often one of the conversations that we have with our students is not just how can we design things better or how can we design things more efficiently, but also are there areas where actually we shouldn't be designing in the first place, or we shouldn't be doing work, or we should let the people that are actually engaged in those spaces do the work because they're more equipped to do it. And so cultural studies and media studies is, I think, one important lens that we can bring into our work to help talk through some of those questions.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, first let me look at the room, physical room, and whether there are some questions from the room. Any questions from the audience, physical audience? There is one, yeah. Okay, let's pass the microphone. We have one question. Yeah.
Hello, by the way. My name is Eren from Assoc University. I want to talk about ethics. I think the first thing we noticed in this education is going to be ethics, because the ethics is the most important thing in the world, in my opinion, because the last time I was in London in a Google conference, so the AIs, all of the computer-human interactions are based on ethics. So what do you think about the ethics of the computer or ethics on the ethics of the human? Because sometimes humans, okay, we have conscience, but sometimes the computer is doing what we tell. So can we trust on humans' consciousness, humans' ethics? So how can we teach the right ethics? Not humans. Every human has a different ethics sometimes, So how we can teach the machine the ethics of the humanity?
That is a very rich and big question. I appreciate the question a lot, though. I've been focusing for a number of years now on professional ethics and HCI specifically, and just wrapping up a 4-year project in this space. It feels like there are two different sort of sets of ethical considerations that are sort of embedded in your question. One is about essentially how do we engage students in thinking about ethics as a part of their profession, so professional ethics. And there I would maybe draw apart ethics, values, and morality, because often we tend to lump some of those concepts together, and it can make it really complicated to do some of the other work. And in a lot of the research that I've done, I've really advocated for students to become conversant in a pragmatist ethics tradition, because HCI designers are designing new things. They're reshaping the world in important ways. And so being able to consider that reshaping as a point of power and a point of responsibility is really, really important. The other piece of your question was really thinking about how ethics can be embedded into digital systems. And there are sort of two ways of thinking about this. One is sort of the classic view coming from philosophy of technology, that we are always already embedding values into the systems that we create. So this is a value inscription process. But it sounds like the perspective you were taking is how can we maybe build values explicitly into digital systems as well, so that they are ethical or have some ethical character to them. And I think that that is a much more challenging question, as we're sort of seeing with this very rapid paced rollout of these AI systems right now, where it's unclear that even if you had designed values in from the beginning, because of the black box nature of these systems, whether it can ever really fully be realized as an ethical system. So lots more that I could say here, but I think starting by sort of differentiating what domains we're talking about ethics in, whether it's educating a person that's inscribing things into a system, or building a system that has those things by default. Those are all really different areas of research and scholarship that we'll need to work on a little bit further.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Any other question from the room? It looks like no other. One more? Okay. The same
One more
person.
question.
He has one more question. Okay.
So, in ethics issue, I think about that we should check the both sides, the machine and the human. They both needed to check. So how can we check the both of them? Because, sometimes the machine can't do the right thing. So sometimes the human can be evil, So how can we check both of them and do the right ethics about that?
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, again, I think it's a really important question, but I would maybe propose shifting from what is the right ethics to thinking about ethics for whom, which is where sort of the discourse has been over the last 10 or 15 years within these more sort of critical approaches to technology studies. And so we could take sort of a classic ethics view and say, let's apply a deontological framing to this to figure out what are the rules that we should be operating by, or consequentialists, what is the worst thing that could happen if this rolls out, and are we okay with that worst thing happening, or how can we safeguard against that? But a lot of these digital systems that are being developed now, just taking one of those perspectives isn't going to be enough. I mean, there are many disciplines that have codes of ethics, and they still produce really harmful things. And so those aren't going to fix the problem and help us create ethical outcomes by default. Instead, I think this is part of a conversation we need to have that's ongoing. As we learn about new risks, how does that influence product development? As we consider current and future harms, how are we taking those on and doing something with that knowledge? And that is that more pragmatist tradition where we're embedding some of the ethical responsibility, not in the process, but in the people that are doing the work and in the systems that are being developed as a result. It's not a satisfying answer, but I think it's a complicated space that we sort of have to resist just this tendency to reduce things down to checklists or some of these requirements, which feel very easy to adopt, but often will give us a false sense of security that we've addressed all the ethical considerations rather than viewing this as an evolving task.
Thank you. Okay, so since there are no other questions, let me ask my question. I mean, as I told you, I mean, my journey also on HCI started at Indiana University. I mean, I took my first HCI class in 1998, I think, from School of Informatics, School of Information Science. And that was actually individual courses, HCI courses. One course was given by Marty Siegel from the Instructional Technology Program. And then they established a separate HCI program under School of Informatics. So, I mean, we see similar HCI programs like Carnegie Mellon University. They have a great HCI program. Wisconsin Medicine, which my daughter is also, she's doing PhD on HCI over there. They have a great program over there. So there are different flavors and different emphases. I think if the institution has more engineering oriented, they have different thing. If the social sciences are more strong, or psychology is more strong, they have different flavors. So this also makes things a little bit challenging, I think, to make a program. I mean, where should we put more emphasis? I mean, we had to make some technological developments, for example, because technology is moving so fast. So should we put more on technical side, engineering side, or should we put more on psychology or to design or other fields? I mean, social sciences. So since you're in one of the leading HCI programs, so what would you suggest to those who are planning to establish a separate HCI program? As I said, I mean, we have now separate courses under different disciplines, but eventually in Turkey we also need to establish some separate HCI programs, either undergrad or graduate programs.
Yeah.
What would be your suggestion? What are the challenges that you faced, and what do you suggest for professors?
Yeah, no, this is a great question, and one I think about a lot. Even within the EduCai community that I mentioned previously, we have a lot of diversity. Some, there's some that have complete, comprehensive programs in HCI and UX, but there are many, many out there that have a single undergraduate course, or maybe just a handful of sort of disconnected undergraduate courses. So I think this is a challenge that's experienced by many people. Probably the most important thing that I would start with is building that program level alignment on what you want to accomplish, which really has to come even before the content or the content perspectives that you're wanting to drive. So for instance, here at IU, when I came back to direct this program, their emphasis has been for more than 20 years on design-focused HCI. And so I was sort of given that philosophy. At Purdue, the driving emphasis was studio education. So it's all about, we're going to do a studio-based program that has some implications on how we're going to design. And then downstream, we will figure out what are the perspectives that are going to come into that environment. So building that sort of holistic container for the program is, I think, key, because if you have people on board at that stage, then it makes a lot of the other conversations much, much easier as you get further down into the program development. At sort of the second stage, I think figuring out which disciplinary perspectives are going to be involved is a very, very crucial conversation to have. There are probably some things that you really just need to have. So there probably does need to be some mix of technical skill and social science, because that's just sort of the nature of HCI as a discipline, and probably some voice from design. But even a word like design could be taken up in a number of different ways. Are we meaning design in a very artistic tradition? Or are we meaning design in the very problem solving, Riddle and Weber, wicked problems sort of orientation? Are we thinking about design as product design or industrial design? So I think figuring out a mix of those three characteristics would probably be a really good place to start. What kind of technical knowledge, what kinds of social science knowledge, what kinds of design knowledge? And then figuring out what the balance of those three elements is going to be. Mm-hmm. Then you can always add from there based on what faculty perspectives that you have. So at Purdue, we had faculty that were core to HCI and UX, but one of them also had experience in data visualization. Another one of them had experience in industrial design. And I had experience in educational research and learning experience design. And so that enriched the overall program, even though our program wasn't focused in any one of those areas. And so I think celebrating that difference is also probably really important as you're building that alignment and then projecting that out to students as well.
Okay. Great, thank you very much. I appreciate your comments. It looks like there is no other question, and it is already late over here, around 5 p.m. So thank you very much, and hope to meet you in face-to-face in some other conferences, even maybe in Bloomington. I would like to visit again. I miss my days over there. So, okay. Thank you very much. Again, I appreciate your contribution to our conference. Thank you.
Thank you so much.